Hello and welcome to Dr. Akmal Makhdum's YouTube channel, and we're discussing coronavirus and grief. Today we're going to be discussing the last three stages of grief. So Dr. Akmal, would you like to give us a little bit of a recap very quickly and then the next stages?
We talked about various stages and we talked of the 7 stages of grief, but in this particular discussion with COVID-19 or coronavirus, we talked of the pre-preparation in which we invited people to talk about bereavement and grief because we are almost touching 1,000 deaths a day. And US has had more than 10,000 deaths, and Italy is having 900 and so on. So all across Europe there is this spree of death going on. So it is something extremely relevant to us, and I think it is important that people who are confronting corona through self-isolation, whatever steps they're taking, that they should be looking at a discussion about morbidity. If they fall ill, what happens? What are the resources that they should, bring to the front? And I think that even in a household, people should actually prepare a particular room where they can
Escape if they need to.
escape if something happens. And so the second bit is the discussion about bereavement and death. And the other thing that I suggested was that because this is an extremely different way of dealing of confrontation of death, in terms of that the living loved one is taken away, and then you may not see that person because that person is totally isolated from you. And that is why there is that dual or treble shock and regret.
Right, okay.
Now, then we talked of the stage of shock.
Yeah.
Then we talked of the stage of denial.
Yes.
And, shock being, disbelief. And then the stage of anger, when you are constantly expressing your emotions. And then the bargaining with Providence, with God, and saying that, please reverse this and so on. And as I said that in COVID, there is this double bargaining that can happen.
Right, which we've discussed in the other video. So now let's move on to the next three stages and the final three stages, which you mentioned earlier. And as you mentioned before, just a disclaimer that there's no particular order for this.
So the next stage that comes is actual depression. So depression is that stage that comes after the previous, the ups and the downs of shock and anger and bargaining and denial and so on. And depression is a kind of a consolidation stage where things begin to dawn upon you that it has really happened. And that's when you become low. You do not show anger, but you show disappointment and acceptance in terms of that it is there. I'm confronted with this particular loss, and you then get into sad mood, depressed mood. Sleep may be impaired, lethargy may come into play, lack of emotions in the sense of being unable to laugh, being unable to enjoy food, no energy, no motivation, or less energy and less motivation. So you see a whole spectrum of depressive symptomatology, and the underpinning emotion at that time is that it has happened. So that's where depression comes in.
Okay, and before we move on to the next stage, what techniques would you give people to cope with it, or that, like you mentioned, the other people in the home to help them cope with someone who's reached the depressive stage?
Now, in terms of depression, the important thing is that what is the degree of depression? Now, we need to know that with corona-related deaths it'll be very important that we look at abnormal grief reaction, because it is an extremely abnormal circumstance. For people, it is unexpected. It is just like, in a civil war or in a country in war, being invaded by invisible enemy, that you go out and you come back, and after a little while you're gone again, sometimes for a long period and sometimes forever. And at least almost 1,000 people or families a day are experiencing somebody going and never coming back. And that's happening in England.
Yeah.
Now, the important thing here is that when you come to a stage of depression, you need to see whether the intensity is mild, moderate, severe, or profound. If it is mild, then what we call supportive conversations can occur. A sharing of grief can occur and can help. One can model the other person's emotions and feelings, because as I said, that 4 people in the household may be at different stages, and some persons may be able to help the other, but everybody gets together to help one another. So I would suggest that in the mild stage, that is what you do. In the moderate stage, I think maybe a degree of professional counseling may be required, in which you can get some cognitive counseling, some supportive counseling, some analytic counseling, and or some eclectic counseling. And in that way, it can be done over the telephone. It can be done through the internet. It can be done on the computer. And sometimes the problem with depression is that your concentration is not so good. So it needs a guide to help you through that. Because if you're already depressed, your concentration has to be impaired.
Okay.
And if the concentration is impaired, you are then not able to look at a screen and do exactly as the screen says and write down things and remember all that. Because that is a time when you need somebody to hold your emotional hand. If it is severe, and by severe, what it means is that your sleep is really impaired, your appetite is very bad, you have zero energy, your crying is persistent, and then you start talking about death in a passive manner, that life is not worth living, and so on. So which is something that can happen and happens in grief. If it is to that stage, and it is happening after all the previous 4 or 5 stages that we talked about, and it has happened over a period of a number of weeks and months, then I think that you are looking at psychiatric intervention.
Okay.
And that means that a form of antidepressant, some form of antidepressant, albeit small dose, may be required.
But that's obviously up to the professional.
That is obviously up to the professionals, and if it is profound, when somebody is acutely and proactively looking at ending their lives because of grief, and that's where.
And I think in the lockdown it's actually quite dangerous because we are locked down, so accessing this mental health help is not as easy, but there are lots of numbers, and I will be putting that in the caption below this video. So okay, so that's the question.
Samaritans is one course.
That's an excellent service. So then let's move on to the others, because we're going to run out of time. I'm going to touch on.
And then what happens is, after depression, then there is a stage where you are testing your life after the stage of depression.
Okay.
And
what do you mean by this?
What I mean is that in this stage, you start to look at alternatives in life. Can I find a new job?
Okay.
Can I find a new set of friends? Can I put myself into this particular vocation? Can I do this charitable work or some form of other activity which will then create a little meaning? And in that, what you look at is what are the realistic expectations or alternatives of life. Um, People, sort of, it depends on people's circumstances. Now, I must warn against one thing, and that is counterintuitive, what I'm about to say. In depression, it is very easy to fall in love.
Okay.
So it is very, very important not to do that.
Because you become codependent.
Or because you are already in a very dependent state and you're looking for some form of a, rescuer, the knight or the princess in shining armor or, whatever. So it is extremely important that you keep your wits about you at that time. It is very easy to fall for the romantic alternative at the first, comforting shoulder.
Right.
So it's very, very important not to do that.
Absolutely.
Because grief is a vulnerable state. In grief, people are known to do rash things.
Okay.
And so if you are depressed, you're really catching at straws at that time. And if you're catching at straws, then any straw that you hold, and that's it. So that is one warning, I must say.
And also, I think trying to find happiness in someone else and relying on someone else, that's also very dangerous territory. And
maybe, but the thing is that, it may happen later on whenever you've gone through it. But when you're going through stages of grief, some people want to cut it short, find distraction. This particular process will require its due respect.
Okay.
You cannot disrespect grief.
Right, okay. So we've only got 4 minutes left. So quick
There's
techniques.
the last one, yeah.
First techniques about testing and how to keep it safe.
Well, the thing is that there aren't really techniques in that sense. What you need to know is, what are your financial alternatives? What are your social alternatives? What are your, sort of vocational alternatives? What are your habit options? Or you want to get into 2 hours of painting a week or 3 hours of running a week and all that. So you look at alternatives, whether you want to sublimate it or make it into a productive exercise, or you want to hang on to, become a leech onto somebody else and try to suck some support out of that. So that is where testing comes in. And I think testing requires a degree of reflection. And that is why I said that it has to be an interpersonal grief process. And the last one is the stage of acceptance. Now, this is quite a solemn stage in which you've been through denial, anger, trauma, emotion, bargaining, etc. And then you are looking at, because there is a lot of guilt involved with testing. Am I looking at this particular thing because I'm trying to find a diversion from a loved one and so on. So all these are very sobering and somber emotional states. And the last one is acceptance, when you cognitively and emotionally won. Right. So your emotions and your thinking and your brain, your heart and the brain are saying, this is what's happened. I have been through an acute and whatever stage of grief. I've been through all these various stages in different forms and shapes, and it has actually happened. So I need to now finally look at a way forward. So all the previous ones are preludes to this slightly, it may not be happiness as a result of acceptance. But the acceptance may be quite a depressing or a persistently, longitudinally unhappy stage.
Acceptance.
Even acceptance. But the thing is that there is a kind of ability to live.
Right. Okay, and we rushed the last one, so we may touch upon that in the next episode before we move on to the next topic. Sure. But if you do need any help or any suggestions, any questions, do write to us and we will answer your questions and include your discussion in our thoughts of the day.